people,
we
to
hear a lot
indigenous
about
people,
Colombia
and to the
through
other
the social
oppressed
media, but there's also
nationalities
a lot of
of the United
manipulation
States.
of information on the
We
social
know
media.
that,
And there are
again,
very
the
few
United
international
States, and we argue
organisms
that it's an
that have
empire,
taken a
uh,
firm
again, whose
position
foundation
regarding.
is a white settler colony, that the indigenous population was suppressed and genocide was waged against the indigenous population. We know that African peoples' introduction into the United States were as captives, and there was exploitation of our labor, uh, super exploitation of our labor. We didn't come over here as settlers to seize the land of the indigenous population. We also know that even after emancipation, we were not allowed to choose what our relationship was going to be with the United States government. Some argue that we had options, that we could have, some of us could have, if we decided, return to our homeland. Some of us would have decided US citizenship, and many of us would have decided to have our own independent nation state on land that our ancestors had tilled for generations. We know that even the United States Constitution is rooted in settler colonialism and racial slavery. In the United States Constitution that was implemented in 1787, it stated our ancestors weren't whole people, but were 3/5 of a person. It stated in that document that our ancestors who escaped and ran away, if they were captured, were to be returned to the slaveholders. It also stated that for a 20-year period from 1787 to 1807, that the United States government would allow the traffic of enslaved Africans, what is called the Middle Passage, or also the transatlantic slave trade, to exist, and the United States government was able to tax our ancestors who were brought in during that period. So the United States is founded on that. And we argue that our relationship with the US empire is still a colonial relationship. Um, that and that could be confusing. For instance, you mentioned Keith Ellison, and some people might point to that you had an African American president, Barack Obama, or the vice president is Kamala Harris, is a woman of African descent. Um, our people, which might be confusing and complex, but due to the struggle of our ancestors for representation, due to the struggle of people like Martin Luther King and others, civil rights movement, it's created space within the U.S. imperialist state for representation of Black people. But where I will agree with Professor Mintz, it's a system not only based on capitalism, but based on these colonial relationships, settler colonial relationships. So when we talk about systemic racism or structural racism, these structures are set in place, not only in law, but also in reality. Also, the relationships in terms of social relationships and the relationships between communities and the state, between communities and the economic system are set in place. One example of these relationships is our people's relationship to policing in this country and the so-called justice system. Um, it's evidence of the continued colonial reality of African people, or what some of us call new African people, with the US imperialist state. Black communities are still subject to occupation by what my comrade and our movement ancestor, Baba Chokwe Lumumba, called soldier cops. You know, police aren't seen as their slogan, but in our communities, as people who protect and serve us, but they're seen as instruments of occupation. and instruments of terror in our communities. The roots of policing in the United States are tied to the slave patrols. During the period of time of our enslavement in this country, patrols were instituted or utilized to capture our ancestors who attempted to escape or who did escape. There were also slave patrols set up to suppress any form of insurrection by the enslaved. Anytime there was a rumor of insurrection, of rebellion, of resistance, these slave patrols would be mobilized, which would include in the South where I live, any white male who was an adult would be mobilized to participate in these slave patrols. After emancipation, after our freedom from enslavement, there was other elements that relate to the criminal justice system. Emancipation, which occurred in the United States to the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, had a provision that said if you, they would eliminate forced labor or what they call involuntary servitude except for punishment for a crime. If you're convicted of a crime, then you could be forced to work for the state at that time. And this led to a widespread system of what was called convict labor, particularly in the southern states where I live. Many of the institutions, even some of the prisons themselves, were built by incarcerated labor. So replacing the system of forced labor, this convict labor, this labor of prisoners was utilized. And in some ways still exists today, even in privatized prisons that have been established in the United States. Another element is with the mechanization of agriculture and the demand for labor in urban factories, particularly in manufacturing, mass migration occurred of our people to urban areas. And during that time, there was a corresponding investment to expand police forces in these urban areas to what? Control Black people, to make sure that we were under control, to make sure that we were terrorized. And so this occupation of these urban communities was expanded at that particular time. Fast forward to the 1960s. In the 1960s, particularly after the assassination of Martin Luther King, there were urban rebellions in these cities where Black people live with substandard housing, with poor housing, with limited and poor education, with limited economic opportunities. And so there were rebellions in these places, particularly in response to the police occupation of our communities. And after these rebellions occurred, and particularly with the activism for Black power to get Black self-determination, even more militarized forms of policing developed to control our communities and to counter Black resistance. In the United States, the first militarized police unit called Special Weapons and Tactics, also known as SWAT, Special Weapons and Tactics. It was first used against the Black Panther Party in Los Angeles, California in December of 1969 and became a model for police across the United States. So this militarized policing is very much tied to attempts to suppress Black resistance. With the decline of manufacturing in the United States in the 1970s and beyond, and without a way to replace that employment and means of survival in our communities, the underground economy, particularly the drug economy became a viable means for survival for large sectors of the Black working class. The increase of drug traffic was responded to by the state with what they call a war on drugs that focused even more intense policing and occupation of Black communities and increased mass incarceration of Black people, as opposed to targeting the criminal enterprises, the international criminal enterprises at the top. Attention was played on arresting poor and working class Black and brown people who were in the lower rungs of the drug trade. These are examples, there are even examples, though, of the imperialist state, elements of the imperialist state clandestinely participating in the traffic of narcotics for its own interests. We know, particularly during the Ronald Reagan administration, the drug traffic was used to finance the funding of the Contra War in Nicaragua. And so that's been very well documented. So the continuation of this excessive policing and occupation of our communities is what leads to the current slogan of Black Lives Matter. The statement that Black Lives Matter is evidence that genocide is a reality and the US government is guilty of the violation of our basic human rights. We must also point out, as our sister Charo mentioned, our resistance has been criminalized in the United States. And because of the criminalization of our resistance, then we have political prisoners. We have people who even engaged in the 1970s in armed struggle who are, by international law, should be classified as prisoners of war, as well as we have exiles in Cuba, in Africa, in other places. This resistance is important. And I will say this, to add on to what Brother Mintz said, I think there's an element independent of the composition of the jury, and that's the massive resistance that occurred in the streets. Because of this massive resistance, the police and the prosecutors were willing to sacrifice Chauvin because people were protesting in the streets. And they knew if they didn't get a conviction in this case, not only in the United States, but worldwide, there was going to be resistance because the covers had been pulled off. With the 9 minutes that Chauvin was on George Floyd's neck, it just exposed the terror that Black people go through. So I don't see this as the new trend because it took a tremendous amount of resistance to bring that about. And the question is it sustainable? As Brother Mintz mentioned, there have been a lot more killings of Black people, heinous killings of Black people since George Floyd. That's been our reality in this country since we've been here. In 1976, I lived as a young man in Los Angeles, California, where I was an activist. There were 52 Black people killed in Los Angeles that year by police. That's one for every week in a year. One for every week in a year. What's different today is because of social media, because of people's ability to use camera phones and to document these atrocities, people see them and it become a worldwide phenomenon. But the question is, are we organized to maintain that resistance? So I want to close here, Brother Chucho. I just want to sum up by saying the persistence of this colonial relationship between our people and the imperialist state is a continuation of genocide, that we must have self-determination, our right to control our political, economic, and social affairs. I agree we need a new system, as Brother Mintz said, but we also got to remember the United States and Cuba, that the white working class in the United States doesn't have a proletarian consciousness, right? You saw the many of the white working class in Washington, D.C. on January the 6th, supporting the fascist Donald Trump. So we have a different reality here. We need reparations, not only for slavery, but these lives lost and for the trauma that we face right now in the United States. My grandchildren are dealing with this trauma, and this trauma is genocidal. So self-determination and reparations are necessary for us to free our people and to free the land. Thank you, Brother Chucho. Thank you to my co-panelists, and looking forward to more engagement. Free the land.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Kingele. Thank you for your extraordinary participation, and Sharon, Mina from Colombia, and our Agus Mintz, our dear brother, who is living in Minnesota, but he comes from New Orleans, right? And I remember that we enjoyed with his family. We met with his family and we spent a wonderful time together in New Orleans when we was working there. Well, the one conclusion of this webinar, this is the third webinar that we organized on this topic, because in two previous occasions we discussed Haiti. One on the attacks on Haiti and the trial on Haiti. Diogenes Diaz also participated. He represented Afro-Venezuelans and represented the institute there. And the second was another seminar on the need of a new constitution, the need to demand what these Haitian presidents did with more than $2 billion. But the Bolivarian government, first Chavez and then President Maduro, gave them through the Venezuelan solidarity. So that's why the Haitians are requesting, are demanding where the money is. We are a people of solidarity and people of peace. So these topics, a bullet going through the body of a man or a woman in Colombia, an assassination in cold blood in Atlanta and other US cities, or the case of Floyd, uh, it hurts. They hurt to us in the region for Afro-descendant people. We are commemorating 20 years in the Third World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa. And there we considered slavery as a crime against humanity and racism as the mortal danger for humanity. Therefore, this dialogue between Venezuela, Colombia, the United States, and other countries is important. I think this has been very instructive discussion to understand better the current struggles. In the case of Sharon, representing millions of Black Colombian women, she translates what is going on in Colombia. What Kingele and August say, well, the voices of thousands are represented, of those who have been assassinated, of those in Mississippi when we sang with Billie Holiday. the weird fruits, something like that, the name of the song. So this is important. Now we're going to ask Johannes to summarize this seminar, and then we're going to give final conclusions, suggestions given by Sharon, by August, and Kinjele. So we continue in this struggle because the rest of our of our lives we need to continue struggling. There is no way back. We need to continue struggle against this criminal system. So Diogenes has the floor for a summary, and then you can finally address us to give your own conclusions.
Bueno, Diógenes no se está escuchando.
We are not getting Diogenes for some reason.
No se te escucha.
We cannot hear him. But let's do the following. Let's give the floor to Sharon in the meantime for her to give us some ideas on how we can express world solidarity. We have the United Nations Human Rights Council. In Colombia, you are in relation with the American Human Rights Commission, but there are other ways we can use the social networks. What do you suggest, Sharon, for us to try to find a solution to the Colombian crisis? Thank you, Chucho, and thank you for all the interventions. You are giving a number of elements which are very important. In the case of Colombia, we need to continue exercising pressure because the government is deaf and blind. This ultra-right government is convinced that they have all the advantages of impunity. So we need to continue pushing. So the world, there's an international pressure to break these barriers imposed by this government regarding impunity. There are a number of petitions, demands, and this visibility is very important. However, I think we need to look inwards. All of us, we are part of grassroots movements. So it is very important for Colombia, both regionally and globally, that we strengthen the bonds between the various organizations and grassroots movements in the region. We need to strengthen the links that once upon a time were very strong, that are still there, and we need to really further them even more at the level of the Afro-descendant grassroots movements and groups. This space of education, discussion, these spaces are useful, but I think we need to find other ways to generate a common front in order for us to be able to resist better. Here we have a very important political movement. We have a very strong Black woman who is a candidate to become president. We know all the risks that we need to bear in mind in Colombia. We know that this is very risky. It's not easy. We cannot be president of Colombia overnight. This has a lot of political implications. However, we need to challenge the established powers, the establishment. And this is not to request or take 2 years, 4 years. We've been fighting for 27 years as Maroons, 500 years of Maroon struggle. So this is a long struggle. However, we need to strengthen the possibilities of convincing people that we need at least to continue finding the ways to destabilize these systems, perverse system underpinned by terror and nourished by racism. Akijele said that we do not have a society, neither here nor in the United States or in the region. We do not have a society that fully understands that we have racism and how racism works and how society is part and parcel of this racism. So we need to continue working on this to denounce this racism because we need more and more to have an anti-racist position that would truly help to undermine racism and to undermine capitalism as the basis for racism. So we need to then to strengthen our bonds of political organizations, these common fronts in the region in order to generate new strength and new forces to destabilize these systems. And for that, we need to have alternative and more democratic governments elected in the region. And we need to have a pluridiverse nation in order to overcome this monologue that we are having and what we call nation. In our case, Colombia.
Ahora la palabra a
We are
aquí
now
a
going to give the floor to August Mintz.
Okay.
And then in the end, Diogenes is going to give a synthesis. But next, we're going to give the floor to August Mintz, then to Akinyele, and then in the end, we're going to give the floor to Mr. Diogenes. So August, is it the turn? It's your turn.
Thank you very much, Chucho. I was really pleased to learn from Sharon about the situation in Colombia, and it was very informative, and especially the current situation, the protest, and how that relates to the Black struggle in Colombia. So I really appreciate what she had to say. Yeah, I just wanted to underscore something very important that Akinyele said, and it's very, very important. It was the mass movement that made the trial take place. Were it not for the mass movement, there wouldn't not have been a trial. And I had the privilege a year ago yesterday was the first George Floyd protest. It was the first one. I had the privilege of being there, and it was very significant because it took place in the middle of the pandemic and the lockdown. And the mayor of Minneapolis had suggested that we couldn't assemble. We had to be masked, but we had to be socially distanced. And there was no way that we could be socially distanced of 5,000 people at 38th in Chicago. So yeah, there was no social distancing. But 5,000 of us came out, and most significantly, the police were not to be seen. You couldn't find the police because they still had blood on their hands. That's why the police were not there to enforce the mayor's order about social distancing. I can't emphasize that enough, because leading up to the march, the mayor had sent his police around town stopping basketball games on courts, saying that you were violating the rules of the pandemic and the lockdown. So what happened a year ago, yesterday, I argue was the beginning of Liberation Day for the masses who had been locked down. The second thing, most importantly, is that it was a multiracial protest. In fact, more than half of the participants were Caucasian. And here in Minnesota, we sometimes take that for granted, especially since about 2012. But for those of us who remember the 1960s and witnessed anti-police brutality protests, those protests were almost exclusively an African-American affair. In fact, if you were white, you could have lost your life being around those protests. That's what happened in Los Angeles in 1992. There was a white truck driver named Reginald Denny almost lost his life for being in the vicinity of the protests. And so, but no, these protests were multiracial. We've never seen that before. That's new. And so it registers the potential. That's what I was talking about, registers the potential for doing something significant. We've never had these kinds of mass protests that have multiracial in character. And that was seen globally, of course. And I thought one of the most interesting things about the global significance of the George Floyd protests is what happened in Nigeria. In Nigeria, thousands of people came out to the street, and it wasn't about white police, it was about black police, because the police are the police. This is what the police do. And this is why the masses came out in the streets in Nigeria. They identified with the struggle here. That's important for us to know. If we don't want to just limit it to the question of race, but no, this is the police. Wherever you have class society, wherever you have class inequality, you need the police to enforce class inequality. That's what the police do, no matter where the society is. So that's what I'm saying. I think we have opportunities today, and I think it was reflected in the decision of the jury. And again, that was historic. We've never had a jury in which white people, half the jury was white. We've never had a conviction in the United States in which half of the jury is white, that convicts a white cop for killing a black man. That's never been seen before. That's what happened in California. That didn't happen in 1992. The all-white jury would not convict the 4 cops. And so I'm saying a lot has changed, and we have opportunity to build upon it, to do something really revolutionary, to do what the Cubans did. It's only what the Cubans did. That's how the Cubans have taught us how to get rid of police brutality. That's what the Cuban Revolution has taught us. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Agustín. Ahora corresponde.
Thank you, August Mintz. Now we are going to give the floor for the closure of this meeting to Professor and our friend Akinyele Umoja.
Thank you again, Chucho, and thank you again, Charo and Brother Mintz. Yeah, I really, building on what my co-panelists have said, I think there are important points. Number one, that Charo mentioned the need for a common front. And when she said a common front, she's saying on an international basis that our Afro-descendant movements need to have a common front. And I think that's very important. Our group here in Atlanta on Malcolm X Day, we had a statement in solidarity with the Afro-Colombian movement. But we need to move beyond statement to being out in the street about the Afro-Colombian movement. And so that resistance that I talked about and that Brother Mintz also just mentioned is important that we be able to build that. I had the opportunity at the invitation of Chucho and comrades in Venezuela to come and speak about reparations in the United States. And when I was asked by comrades there, well, what can they do? And we talked about when there are issues of reparations, can they go and be in the street in Venezuela about it, just as we need to be in the street about what's happening in Colombia and other places. So we need to build that type of unity that Malcolm X talked about across the Americas. That's one thing. And I think, and I want to applaud the Cimarrones in Venezuela for kind of leading, bringing us together around on that. Number two, I think when I was in Venezuela for the International Reparations Symposium, they also had the Cimarron youth meeting at that time. We need to get our young people that we're developing here in the United States and other places, Cuba, Brazil, together with our brothers and sisters, younger brothers and sisters in Venezuela, to try to build that next generation of Cimarron or Quilombo, as we call it, tradition. Also, and I want to also bring greetings for the National Council of Black Studies. And I think in all of our places, we need to develop these institutes that give a different interpretation of our struggle. I finally, Brother Mintz mentioned the dynamic of, in this last protest, we saw multiracial dimensions. And of course, as I mentioned, it was global. One thing we always want to remember is that we have to articulate our struggle, what our struggle is about, what the goals of our struggle. We have to have self-determination. And so if we don't do that, then our struggle can be diverted. And so we appreciate the allies who come in the streets, but just like I don't attempt to speak for women in the struggle against patriarchy, I have to follow their lead and let them voice their own experience and pain, and I fight in solidarity with that. And so our struggle has to be seen in similar light. The Black people need to be the voice to articulate and to lead our own struggle. And so thank you again for this opportunity. Peace and power and freedom land.
Oh. Ok, bueno. Muchas gracias a ustedes tres.
Thank you very much to the three of you. Evidently, the situation and the focus that you have given, it's a focus that has to do with system. This is a system. And we have not escaped that racism here in our country. We can remember that 3 or 4 years ago, racism was transmitted from the KKK of the United States. That is present also here in Venezuela. If George Floyd was asphyxiated, or if in Colombia they have killed by shooting people, they have killed Afro-Colombian leaders, well, here in Venezuela, in a white slum, they burned alive a young man named Orlando Figueras. Here in Venezuela, racism is present. Recently, a minister also died. An Afro-descendant minister, Aristobal Isturiz, died. Part of the society as a system filled the social media, sending messages and saying that he was a monkey, that he was a demon. And there was an extraordinary ritual that we did here to pay tribute to him with drums, with African drums, with his own people, the first Negro people or Black people community. So that white bourgeoisie filled the social media with messages. Those white people said that we were doing witch acts. They said, how are they going to perform such an act in the National Assembly of Venezuela? We also have our own George Floyds, and we have to fight against that. It is a process, that we are going to confront and that we are indeed already confronting here in this country. Diogenes is a member of the ARAC. It's an organization that was established 10 years ago, and he's one of the mentors of the networks, of the regional networks, Afro-descendant networks for the Americas and the Caribbean. One of the founders was Aristobulus Turis. So next, in order to close this meeting, which is going to be transmitted and broadcasted, because I believe this meeting is quite pedagogic, is well systematized. It has been filled with academics, with specific practices. So evidently, this will be a program that will be disseminated as a pedagogic system. Diogenes, now you have the floor. You have 5 minutes to talk.
¿Estás escuchando, Chucho? Ahora sí. No, lo que pasa es que tenía en los audífonos.
Okay, I had the headsets. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for that technical fault. Well, first of all, I would like to thank my sister, Shadow Mina Rojas, my dear friend. We always meet in the different spaces. I would like to thank Mr. Mintz and Mr. Omoja. Really, I am not going to repeat your words, the brilliant presentations that you've offered to us. I just want to point out a few elements that are extremely important and that I must emphasize. First of all, for pedagogical purposes, the linkage of the racism, the structural racism as one way of domination, the structural racism that is inherited from the colonization process that began against the will of the people who were brought to the Americas and the Caribbean. That domination system has been interpreted in judicial institutions, in criminal systems, in statistical systems, in ways by which they have applied social control, which has not allowed this social system to be changed. Because the purpose of this type of domination, of this type of structure, controlling structure, makes it possible the existence of a genocide, of extermination. The skin color becomes a jail, the racialization of the crime, the patriarchy, the machismo, the violence against our women and against our daughters and our girls. That is on the first hand. The democratic models, which are the United States and Colombia for the region and for history, is reproduced in that domination system. The racism, the systemic and structural racism, forms part of the inequality. It feeds poverty, and evidently it has to do with the injustice in this type of society. The other thing I want to vindicate very quickly has to do with the capacity of those multitudes that have inherited large fights from the cimarrones up to the independence processes. The ones that have inherited the great struggles of the cumbes, of the quilombos, of the palenques, which today express themselves and are outraged in more than 30 cities of the United States, or that are in the barricades fighting against the injustices. They are fighting against the inequalities, and that is the force of the cimarrona. That is the force that I want to vindicate right now. Those multitudes, those crowds of people who are confronting and who are today raising their voices in the streets, responding to that inequality, to that structural racism, and to that process of exploitation and violence. In the three presentations, I found those elements. Each one of you expressed it from a different point of view. Cheryl talked about the cruelty and the tragedy of our sisterly nation, Colombia. Professor August mentioned all the elements of the different types included in the trial of George Floyd, and evidently the brilliant exposition of Akingele regarding the history of the slave systems, of the political inheritance, and what today is called the need of organizing ourselves. I have to say this because I believe that your presentations were clear, were precise, and on behalf of the ARAC, the regional network of Afro-descendants of the Americas and the Caribbean, of the whole continent, I would like to thank you all for your brilliant expositions. Thank you very much. And that is all I have to say vis-a-vis the excellent expositions that we heard today. Well, the Simón Bolívar Institute and the ARAC would like to thank you for your time. We apologize because we had some delay, but it was worth it. We were able to meet again during this pandemic, and this has been excellent. It has been very interesting. The most important thing is that we will never give up. We have never given up, and we will never give up. We will never give up in our fight. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Sante Sana.